Good afternoon. Welcome to you all, and welcome to this lunchtime seminar organised by the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. My name is Brendan McGeever, and I am the co-director of the Birkbeck Institute. I'm really pleased to introduce to you today our speaker, Dr. Leo Roepert. Leo is a sociologist and works as a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at the Department of Socioeconomics at the University of Hamburg. His research interests include critical theory, the extreme and populist right, racism, and anti-Semitism. He is currently commencing a new project on postcolonial and Marxist social theory. And it's this material that he's going to present to us today in this work in progress paper. As you may have seen on the blurb in the invitation for this event, Leo writes that the definitions of racism and anti-Semitism are fiercely contested in both academia and the public sphere. The understanding of these terms is informed by social theoretical assumptions. In this talk, Leo is going to examine how racism and anti-Semitism as concepts feature in two theoretical traditions, postcolonialism and Marxism. We are really pleased that Leo is coming to BISA to speak to us about this topic today and present this new work in progress material to us all. He'll speak for around 30, maybe 35 minutes before we then open up for questions. So, without any further delay, a very warm welcome and over to you, Leo.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon, for the kind introduction, and also to David and you for the invitation and the possibility to talk to you, and also to Jen and Naomi for organizing all this. I will quickly share my presentation with you, and I hope you can see it. You can see it?
Perfect.
Perfectly. Yeah, my research has for some time focused on the on a historical sociology of racism, and I am interested in the question of how the emergence of different forms of racism are connected to the history and structure of modern society. However, my presentation today is not primarily concerned with the historical investigation of racism. Instead, it addresses conceptual and theoretical questions, namely how racism and anti-Semitism are conceptualized within Marxist and postcolonial social theory. As you all know, racism and anti-Semitism are fiercely debated, both politically and academically. In both cases, there are very different views on how they should be defined, what the scope and limits of the concepts are, what their causes are, what can be done to combat them, and so on. There are a number of reasons for these ambiguities and controversies. Some are objective in nature, I would say. Racism and anti-Semitism are not static and clearly delineated phenomena. They are historical and change their form. They adapt to different social, political, and ideological circumstances. And for this reason, it is impossible, I would say, to conceptualize and conceptually fix either phenomenon once and for all. Theories of racism and anti-Semitism must therefore take into account the changing nature of their objects. On the other hand, there are also subjective and political reasons for differing views. There are different experiences with these phenomena, the perspectives of perpetrators or descendants of perpetrators and of victims, of social majorities and of those affected by racism and anti-Semitism, who are often in the minority. These perspectives are associated with different political interests, and all of these aspects, of course, change depending on national and historical context. So I think the way we talk about these topics in Germany has some similarities, but also differences to the way you talk about these themes in the UK. Finally, there are also theoretical and conceptual reasons for the differing perspectives. Because racism and antisemitism are social phenomena, the way we understand them depends on broader ideas about the society we live in, whether these ideas are implicit or explicit. In other words, the way we think about antisemitism and racism is also connected to the social theories we subscribe to. In my talk, I therefore want to examine two strands of social theory that strongly shape contemporary discussions on racism and antisemitism: Marxist theories and postcolonial theories. I will examine these two strands one after another and structure my discussion around a framing that also underlies the research here at Birkbeck: the idea that antisemitism should be understood as a form of racism. Let me briefly highlight some of the implications of this formulation. If antisemitism is to be understood as a form of racism, then racism is the broader term, while antisemitism is a more specific one. Antisemitism is a particular form of racism alongside other forms such as anti-Black racism, anti-Muslim racism, and others. If racism is understood in this way as an umbrella term, the concept must meet two conditions. First, it must specify the features that are common to all forms of racism. And second, it must define these general features in such a way that there is room for the specific characteristics that distinguish the different forms of racism from one another. By contrast, a general concept of racism is problematic or poorly constructed when features that actually belong to a specific form of racism are treated as general characteristics of racism. The result is that other specific forms of racism no longer fit within the general concept, or that their specific features are effectively dissolved within it. Building on these considerations, I will now turn to Marxist and postcolonial theories, addressing three questions for each. First, how is the general concept of racism within these theoretical paradigms? Second, what are the theory's merits and limitations? And third, how do the two approaches understand antisemitism? Of course, there is not the one single Marxist or postcolonial theory of racism. Each represent a broad and complex theoretical tradition, so I necessarily have to be selective and simplify. My aim is to highlight and discuss particularly influential assumptions and concepts from both strands. And to put it in context, it's worth noting that in a sense, the two strands share a common origin. The early anti-colonial thought was heavily influenced by Marxism, and it wasn't until the 1970s that critiques of colonialism began to move away from Marxism, with postcolonial studies increasingly drawing on post-structuralist theories such as those of Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. So today, postcolonial approaches sometimes compete with Marxist ones, but there are also areas of convergence and mutual influence. Okay, I will start with the Marxist theories. Marxist theories of racism focus on the relationship between racism and capitalism. Already in the first half of the 20th century, there were attempts to apply Marxist theory to the study of racism, for example, William Du Bois or Oliver Cromwell Cox's work. More recent Marxist approaches, often inspired by Kedrick Robinson's concept of racial capitalism, aim to show that there is a necessary rather than merely contingent connection between modern racism and the capitalist mode of production. Marxist approaches seek to demonstrate the significance of racism for the exploitation of labor, showing how it structures class relations, labor markets, and competition, and how it is connected to private property and processes of dispossession. They also aim to understand racism as ideology in the sense of Marx, that is, as a form of false consciousness. A widely held assumption is that racism enables a especially intense form of exploitation, sometimes referred to as super exploitation. The basic idea can already be found in Du Bois, who describes how the exploitation of the colonies contributed to the prosperity of capitalist countries. Du Bois emphasizes that labor in the colonies is exploited to such an extent that wages are often insufficient even for physical subsistence. The situation of minorities, such as black people in the United States, is described as a quasi-colonial condition, and the proletariat is divided among racial lines, with black workers subjected to a higher degree of exploitation than their white counterparts. And this benefits not only the white capitalists, but also the white workers. A different perspective on the economic function of racism can be found in Nancy Fraser's most recent book, Cannibal Capitalism. Fraser argues that if capitalism is understood merely as a system of exchange, it offers no basis for a theory of racism. In markets, all participants are formally treated as equal, and even Marx's theory of exploitation provides little guidance here because, for capital, a worker's skin color is irrelevant as long as they work. There is, however, another process described by Marx that Fraser sees as foundational for racism, and that is the expropriation of resources, land, and labor. Fraser argues that capitalism is dependent on expropriation, and racism, she argues, functions to define the distinction between those who can exploit it as free market participants and those whose land can be seized and whose labor can be forcibly appropriated. While these approaches highlight the strictly economic significance of racism, another argument emphasizes its political function. Racism, the argument goes, prominently put forward, for instance, by Theodore Allen, racism is primarily a means of stabilizing class rule. The racist color line prevents the successful organization of the working class while also obscuring class antagonisms, since white workers or middle class groups can see themselves as part of a superior white hegemony. This can be understood as an intentional divide and rule strategy by the ruling class, or as a process also driven by the white working and middle classes who hope to gain material, social, or even purely symbolic or psychological benefits, what Du Bois and David Rödiger have referred to as the wages of whiteness. Okay, what are central insights and also what are the problems and limitations of the Marxist approach? The Marxist approach argues that racism is regularly or even necessarily produced by the capitalist mode of production. Racism is understood as ideological or institutional phenomenon aimed to enabling and legitimizing economic exploitation and political subordination. It is true that slavery, expropriation, and violence have played a central role in the establishment of capitalism, and there is also more recent, even non-Marxist research, such as the New History of Capitalism, that has highlighted this. It is also correct that racism played a central role in the context of slavery and colonial domination, and that racist ideologies have been used and are still used to explain and justify economic exploitation and inequality. However, Marxist approaches struggle to show what the structural connection between capitalism and racism exactly looks like. While there is some correlation between socioeconomic position and exposure to racism, it cannot be understood as a universal relationship. Many people experience exploitation and domination without facing racial discrimination, and conversely, for instance, a black person may encounter racist discrimination even when they are in a relatively privileged socioeconomic position. And why is it necessary to justify economic inequality through a collectivist racist ideology when it could be just as easily be justified by an individualistic meritocratic ideology? The problem with many Marxist theories, I would say, is that they try to offer a functionalist explanation of the link between racism and capitalism. A functional explanation asks what role a particular element plays in reproducing a larger system. In this case, what role does racism play in sustaining capitalism? Focusing on the effects of racism, this perspective can lead one to mistakenly conclude that its origin and persistence were necessary. So, because capitalism requires racism, it must have emerged. This can lead to an intentionalist interpretation of the origins of racism. The ruling class invented racism because it serves a function for them. Apart from the fact that an intentionalist explanation of a phenomenon as widespread as modern racism is hardly convincing, functionalism has other significant problems. Because it primarily examines the effects of an ideological phenomenon, it tends to pay less attention to its substantive content. Marxist theories of racism therefore rarely investigate the stereotypes, attributions, cultural patterns, images, and fantasies that constitute racism. They also pay little attention to the fact that racist discourses engages not only with the ability of the racialized to work or to possess property, but above all with questions of culture, sexuality, and identity. Because they focus on the function of racism for the economy, it tends to be overlooked that racism possesses its own ideological autonomy and internal dynamic, and often appears in forms that contradict economic rationality. So, alongside those manifestations of racism that serve to legitimize exploitation, there are also forms that exclude racialized groups from economic systems or even aim at their destruction. And I would say that this economically irrational dimension of racism cannot be explained by Marxist approaches. This brings us to the third point. How is anti-Semitism addressed in Marxist theories of racism? And the short answer is not at all, or it is largely absent, I would say. In orthodox Marxism, anti-Semitism was condemned as a petit bourgeois ideology, but there was hardly any deeper theoretical engagement with the phenomenon. And to my knowledge, the only truly influential attempt to understand anti-Semitism with reference to Marx is the famous essay by Moishe Postone, Antisemitism and National Socialism, in which he argues that anti-Semitism constitutes a fetishized form of anti-capitalism, personifying the abstract forces of capitalism in the figure of the Jew. Okay, Postone, he lived some years in Frankfurt, and he was influenced by the Frankfurt School and by a certain interpretation of Marxist theory that was influential at German universities. But this whole interpretation of Marx and this whole theory of Postone is, as far as I can see, not really received little attention in Anglo-Saxon Marxism, I would think. So most Marxist theories of racism follow a more orthodox reading of Marx, and they neither incorporate Postone's theory of anti-Semitism nor engage seriously with anti-Semitism at all. And in a sense, this is not surprising, because if the general concept of racism understands it as an ideology for economic exploitation, anti-Semitism does not fit easily into this framework. In anti-Semitism, Jews are not represented as a group fit for labor or exploitation. Instead, they are depicted as the very agents of economic and political power, as agents of financial capital, and so on. Okay, I come to the second strand to the post-colonial theories. What concepts of racism do we find within post-colonial theory? Of course, we have here different strands and variations, and in this context, I use the term post-colonial in a very broad sense, including also anti-colonial thinkers as well as decolonial theory. In general, we can say that post-colonial approaches understand racism as an essential element of colonial domination. Racism is primarily conceived as an ideology produced by the colonizers and directed against the colonized. In his influential essay on the coloniality of power, Aníbal Quijano understands race as a means of creating a symbolic distinction between colonizers and the colonized, while also stratifying and organizing colonial labor. And in his book, Black Skin, White Masks, Frantz Fanon examines how, within the colonial relationship of power, the white gaze objectifies and dehumanizes the black subject. Paradigmatic for the post-colonial concept of racism is the form of racism based on skin color, particularly the binary racism that distinguishes between black and white, established through the colonial transatlantic slave trade and plantation slavery. Especially critical whiteness studies tend to understand racism primarily as an ideology of skin color, and moreover, they use the term whiteness in a metaphorical sense to describe societal power positions and privileges associated with skin color. Influential for the post-colonial understanding of racism is also Edward Said's book Orientalism, one of the founding texts of post-colonial theory. Although Said understands Orientalism as something broader than racism, his theoretical model can be applied to all forms of racism. Said argues that for Western culture, the Orient is, quote, one of its deepest and most recurring images of the other, end quote. The central idea is that Western identity defines itself by asserting a binary distinction between the Occident and the Orient, attributing to the Orient everything that the West is not or does not wish to be. This can include both negative characteristics as well as projections of Western desires. Ideas about the Orient do not refer to an empirical reality, rather the West constructs the Orient as its other. This model of othering is grounded in a theory of knowledge and power inspired by Michel Foucault, as well as in a social psychological theory of identity, which holds that a stable identity can only be established through processes of exclusion and projection. And there is another central theorist of postcolonialism, Gayatri Spivak, who took up and further developed this concept of othering and emphasizing the fundamental unrepresentability of the other in Western discourses. Said and Spivak mainly engage with the broader framework of Foucault's social theory, but alongside this, another of Foucault's concepts has played an influential role in shaping post-colonial understandings of racism, the idea of biopower or biopolitics. Foucault understands racism as a form of biopolitics, and its function for the state is to divide the population into those deemed productive and useful and those considered a biological threat. While Foucault emphasizes the productive dimension of biopower, the post-colonial theorist Achille Bembe focuses on its destructive side, which he calls necropolitics. For Bembe, racism is a form of necropower. It operates according to the logic of the state of exception, and it's defined by the arbitrary power to kill. For Bembe, National Socialism and its war of extermination and the Holocaust do not represent a historically unique phenomenon. Rather, they are an extreme manifestation of necropower, which is a general feature of the modern state. National Socialism, as Bembe notes with reference to Hannah Arendt, had its roots in European colonialism and its systems of domination and killing. So the true side of necropower is the colony, where the state could govern, wage war, and kill with complete disregard for law. What are central insights and what are the limitations of post-colonial theories of racism? I would say that post-colonial theory rightly emphasizes that the emergence of modern racism is closely tied to colonialism, that racism played a central role in justifying and organizing colonial rule, and that the reference to skin color was a key element of colonial racism. By drawing on Foucault's conception of knowledge and power, postcolonial theory highlights that racism is not merely a matter of prejudice or ideology in the Marxist sense of false consciousness. Rather, it is a practically effective form of power. It shapes not only ways of thinking, but also institutions, subjects. It organizes governance over entire populations. The model of othering shows that the images of the other are always connected to one's own identity. While this insight is not unique to Said, I would say it is nevertheless central to the analysis of racism. Unlike Marxist approaches, this theory highlights an important point. Racism is not only about economic effects or functions or institutions, it is primarily connected to the formation of identity and subjectivity. The problem with postcolonial approaches is that they understand all forms of racism through the model of colonial rule. In particular, racism based on skin color is treated as the prototype of racism in general. As a result, they often overlook other historical and cultural sources and mechanisms of modern racism. So there are numerous forms of racism in which skin color plays only a minor role or none at all, and which are instead based more on cultural or linguistic differences. Postcolonial theory also neglects that alongside colonial expansion, other social developments within Europe were crucial to the emergence of racism. In particular, first, the development of modern bureaucratic territorial states and the resulting cultural homogenization. And second, the restructuring of class relations and the rise of a class of wage-dependent workers, who in the early modern period were also referred to as a race and subjected to stereotypes very similar to those applied to the people in the colonies. In the literature, this is sometimes called class racism. And of course, there were minorities within European societies that had long been targets of hostility, especially the Jewish population. And this hostility has nothing to do with colonial rule. This brings us to the last point, the third question: how is anti-Semitism understood within postcolonial theory? It seems to me that postcolonial theories address anti-Semitism more often than Marxist ones, yet they do so in a problematic way. Anti-Semitism is interpreted through the lens of colonial racism, which has the effect of obscuring it as a distinct phenomenon. So we have a subsumption of anti-Semitism under colonial racism. For example, Edward Said argues that anti-Semitism is actually a form of Orientalism. He interprets the term anti-Semitism literally and in its linguistic sense as anti-Semitism. That is, hostility toward Semites, which includes both Arabs and Jews. The postcolonial scholar Gil Anijar argues that the Jew and the Arab are, in principle, the same hostile stereotype, and draws the following equivalence, quote, Orientalism, aka Islamophobia, aka anti-Semitism, end quote. So for him, this is all the same kind of stereotype. Achille Bembe also argues that every culture and at any time, invents a fictional other. In earlier times, these were the Jew and the blacks. Today, they are the Muslim, the Arab, the immigrant. For Bembe, the mechanisms of othering is therefore basically the same, and the figure of the enemy are essentially identical. He does not distinguish between anti-Semitism, anti-black racism, anti-Muslim racism, or racism against immigrants. A similar tendency can be seen among scholars who draw on the concept of whiteness and try to interpret anti-Semitism through the lens of skin color-based racism. Karen Brodkin and Abigail Bakan argue that Jewish immigrants in the United States were discriminated against in much the same way as other immigrant groups and were perceived as, quote, less than white, end quote. Only once Jews achieved upward mobility into the middle class, they did come to be seen as white. And Bakan even goes so far, she goes so far as to make the somewhat absurd claim that anti-Semitism hardly matters today. What we can see in all of these cases is a highly problematic subsumption of anti-Semitism under a general concept of colonial or skin color-based racism, which effectively obscures the specific characteristics of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism and the various forms of racism are not identical, nor do they emerge from the same social background. Although some anti-Semitic discourse do describe Jews as Orientals or even as black, this does not reflect the mainstream of anti-Semitism. In its dominant form, Jews were assigned specific stereotypes that drew historically from the Christian tradition of anti-Judaism rather than from Orientalist or colonial discourses. The idea that the stereotypes applied to Jews on the one hand and to blacks, Arabs, or Muslims on the other hand is essentially wrong, I would say. Okay, I come to my conclusion. In my talk, I examined how racism is understood within Marxist and postcolonial theory, highlighting both key insights and limitations of each paradigm. I try to show why neither framework provides an adequate concept of anti-Semitism. The problem lies in the fact that both postcolonial and Marxist theories tend to define the essential core of racism in terms of a specific manifestation or function. Postcolonial theory claims that colonial racism, often understood as binary color-based racism, represents the prototype of racism in general. And Marxist theory, on the other hand, argues that racism can essentially be explained through its economic and political function within capitalism. With regard to anti-Semitism, this means that the general concept of racism is constructed in a way that contradicts the specific features of anti-Semitism. As a result, anti-Semitism either does not appear at all or is presented as an interchangeable, unspecific manifestation of colonial racism. This overlooks the specific nature of anti-Semitism. Of course, it is possible to understand anti-Semitism as a form of othering, but the way Jews are constructed as the other differs from the Orientalist other or other forms of racialization. Among the specific features of anti-Semitism is the portrayal of Jews as a powerful hidden group held responsible for all problems of modern society. Because anti-Semitism functions as a kind of a distorted conspiratorial social critique, it does not fit into the framework of postcolonial or Marxist theories of racism. Moreover, one can observe anti-Semitic motives among Marxist and postcolonial scholars themselves, as well as perspectives on Israel and the Middle East conflict that are, to put it mildly, highly one-sided. For example, the decolonial theorist Walter Mignolo claims that secular Judaism became complicit with imperial capitalism, and Israel emerged from this connection. And in the so-called settler colonial studies, Israel is portrayed as a structurally racist and genocidal entity from the beginning. These examples and others that could be cited show that even critiques of racism and broader social critique is susceptible to anti-Semitic motives and ways of thinking. This is likely the deeper structural reason behind the long observed divergence between anti-racism and anti-Semitism. A universalist anti-racist approach must respond to this by developing theories capable of analyzing and critiquing anti-Semitism alongside other forms of racism, taking into account both their shared features and their specific characteristics and differences. And with that, I end and thank you for your attention. And I look forward to the discussion.
Hi.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Leo. Lots for us to reflect on and discuss and possibly argue about as well. That we have I have a whole bunch of questions, but I see there are three hands that are up. So I will take the hands in the order that they come. What we'll do, Leo, is we'll actually take two or three questions if you're okay with that. Is that fine by you? And then you can come back to them sort of in the round. So
Yeah.
first of all, we have Marta Roqueta.
Hi, hello. Are you listening?
Yeah.
Okay, because my cat is blocking my computer, so I don't know if okay. So I have a question. I am Catalan. I am a Catalan scholar, and I am specialized in postcolonial theory from a Catalan perspective. And I wanted to know to what extent the lecturer thinks that uh, the Spanish case can be helpful to find this connection between anti-Semitism, racism, colonialism, etc. Because I'm thinking about what I have studied, and during the creation of the Spanish mother state, first of all, it was the expelling of the Jewish people and the Muslims. So for me, this would be as Orientalism. But on the other hand, there was a colonial process and also an internal colonial process in which Catalans, Basques, Galicians, etc., were like colonialized as well. And actually, the stereotypes between Jewish people and Catalan are more or less the same. So I was wondering to what extent looking to the south of Europe, especially in the case of, for instance, Spain, in which the anti-Semitism and Islamophobia plus racism and interior colonialism were so hand in hand could help to problematize these boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. We're just going to go to the next hand up, which is Christine Aschinger. Christine.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much, Leo. Very interesting talk. I have a ton of questions. I know I can only ask one. I mean, it would be great to go into the weeds on specific theories and discuss how much, they can contribute or not. But following your overall approach to just try to lay out the bare bones of specific theoretical frameworks and their strengths and weaknesses, I was wondering, so from what you say, in a way, what we need would be a theory of anti-Semitism and racism that can ground them in like a social framework. Like, why do they emerge when they emerge and what are their reasons? So we would have to take that from Marxism, if I understand you correctly. But then theories that are non-functionalist, so can cope with irrationality as well, instead of just explaining everything by its use for the capitalist system. and that also pay attention to the content of certain stereotypes and to their specificity, so to different kinds of racism as well as to the specificity of anti-Semitism. And I was wondering, in your list of Marxist theories, I mean, don't we have approaches that at least have tried to make steps in that direction? And what do you think of them? And I specifically think of the Frankfurt School here, who, of course, tried to ground their account of especially anti-Semitism in an analysis of capitalist society, but very much paid attention to also the inherent irrationality of anti-Semitic thinking and politics. And I mean, didn't really put racism center stage, but I was wondering if one couldn't use these approaches and the potential they have to also reflect on racist stereotypes and try to like extend them a little bit beyond their previous limitations. And also, I think that becomes visible in your reference to Postone, who you rightly, I think, connected to the Frankfurt School, because I mean, what he says about anti-Semitism isn't just to say it's a fetish form, but the essay starts very explicitly from the deep irrationality of anti-Semitism, right? And from the specific content of these stereotypes to then arrive at a sort of Marxist explanation. So yeah, in short, what's the potential of the Frankfurt School in your approach? Thanks.
Leo, are you happy to take one more, or do you want to answer these two?
I can also take one more question. I've noticed everything.
Okay, great. So the third question then will be Joseph Finlay, and then Vanda Grace Lawrence will come to you after Leo's come.
Hi Leo, thanks very much. That's great. Couple of things. It seems that you kind of present racism and anti-Semitism as having essential characteristics, that they are one thing in essence. And I wonder why you take that position. One could surely argue the opposite, that they are umbrella terms, plural terms, if you like, that contain a multiplicity of different phenomena under one umbrella. So I just wonder why you take that position. And then I also wonder what might happen if you pushed those categories of Marxist and postcolonial thought a little earlier. So in a way, in relation to Decolonial Judaism, the book by Santiago Slobodsky, which I'd be interested to know how you relate to that. But in terms of medieval Europe, so in terms of Marxist analysis, you could talk about how Jewish money lending was controlled by the state. And that was a form of economic exploitation. The state needed money lending, but it wasn't going to let that money lending be unregulated. So that was a form of economic exploitation. And also, if we consider medieval European state building as a form of colonialism, right? So in sort of internal colonialism, then the Jews become kind of victims of that process of growth and of state building. So I think that might kind of maybe like open a new challenge and maybe opens new ways for which postcolonial and Marxist thought might be more useful. Thanks.
Leo.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. I try to answer them as good as I can. The first thing with early modern Spain and maybe could this help analyzing the early modern situation in Spain help us to understand the interwoven character of different forms of racism? Maybe I'm not too familiar. I'm very curious, and I started just started reading a lot of stuff about it, but I have not really a good overview, especially about the stereotypes that were used against Jews and Muslims in this context. I would say that as far as I understood it, this whole process of expelling Jews and Muslims from early modern Spanish state it started before the colonial expansion, and second, I would say it has more to do with modern nation state building. So I'm not sure if we can analyze the stereotypes in this context as colonial stereotypes, but maybe I am wrong. But yeah, it could be interesting to take this as an historical case study, and I'm really interested in it, but I'm not really an expert. I have to read more about it. The second question, of course, Christine, as you know, of course, I'm heavily inspired by critical theory of Frankfurt School. And when I would have to develop my own theory of racism, then this would be a starting point for me too. And I think, exactly as you mentioned, there are several interesting concepts in the early Frankfurt School that could help us to understand not only anti-Semitism but also other forms of racism. And I think one attractive theoretical approach is to combine a Marxist understanding of society, of societal totality, and combine it with a certain theory of the subject. I think that's important to avoid dysfunctionalist fallacies. I think we need a good theory and also a social psychological theory of the subject to avoid dysfunctionalist problems, and also take into account the irrational sides of also racism, not only anti-Semitism. So yeah, for me it would be, I see a huge potential in it, and yeah, this would also be a starting point for me when I go deeper in all this stuff. And yeah, this book of, what was his name? Slabotsky. I think Brandon,
Yes.
you
San
talked. We talked about that. I didn't have the chance to read it. I only read about it. I'm not sure if he distinguishes different forms of racism or tries to analyze the specific characteristics. I think he has a term called barbarism, which is also kind of an umbrella term. So yeah, I cannot say too much about that because I didn't read it, but it sounds interesting to me, and I will read it. And when I write something, when I will turn this to a paper, I will include this book. To the second point, racism as an umbrella term, I'm not sure if I did understand it correctly. In the German discourse, there are people who try to distinguish anti-Semitism from racism. They say that racism and anti-Semitism are two different terms. We should separate them. And in my talk, I just try to use this Birkbeck formulation as a starting point and try to explain when we understand anti-Semitism as a form of racism, then we have to conceptualize racism as an umbrella term, and then it has to be broad enough to account for all these different forms. So this was my idea.
Thank you, Leo. We have two further hands that are up. Vanda, Grace, Lawrence, and then we'll go to Kat Lou 59. Thanks. Vanda, you are
Sorry,
muted.
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I just want to say, first of all, absolutely fascinating. I'm glad you put the reading list up because it's so rich. I mean, there's so much there. But a couple of things I just wanted to say. One was about the idea of class. And the thing where class, I think, doesn't, for me, fit into racism is because class is movable. So there's a way of defining somebody differently because they can move, whereas the color of your skin or your race is given. So you don't, that's one thing. The other thing that interested me that wasn't mentioned, is what happened with the Irish people. The Irish potato famine, there wasn't just one, there were three. It was a genocide. What I find interesting about what happened in Ireland is that, like hatred of Jews, the point about it is there is a religious, it's not the same, but there's a religious component because it was the Irish Catholics. Church of England had decided we don't want them, it was a split that had to do with religion. It also had to do with language, because Irish people having Gaelic, and so there is also a tribal or a nationality thing there. But I'm just curious, and also about why in discussions I've noticed that Ireland never seems to feature, and that genocide has reverberated for a very long time. That's it.
Thank you. And then over to,
Yeah.
last question.
Yes, I'm sorry, it's my computer job name. My name is Katrin Lundström, and I'm just thank you so much for Leo for sort of like structuring this up. So it was very clear, and I very much agree with everything you said. And I don't study anti-Semitism myself, so I come from whiteness studies, and one thing that I think is problematic in both like theoretical frames is that the idea that only difference is needed for sort of as a base for racism. It's like the closer you get to whiteness or whatever, the more privileged you are. And I think that that's a problematic way of thinking. I think that closeness might be related to racism in a way that has or similarity, or I mean partial similarity, like enemy within, or like I mean different forms of exoticism that is sort of that needs some kind of similarity, and not only difference is sort of related to racism. And I think that's a problem that is like what people start from all the time, that the difference is needed when you talked about skin color. And I don't think that, well, myself, I wouldn't only focus on skin color as a whiteness color, but I think that there is something there that needs to be theorized. I think this closeness or similarity, which is under theorized, I would say. So I look forward to read what you're writing on this. That was all. Thank you.
And then we have a hand up from Ajmal Hussein. Over to you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for allowing me to join the party so late in terms of the questions. Really great to hear your presentation, particularly in terms of how you were able to sort of bring to the fore these various different literatures and traditions of theorizing. If I could just be slightly critical and say that in one sense, there might be certain scholars, for example, I'm thinking of Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy and others, where these two different sort of material and cultural aspects of how racism comes about actually combine in their work. And Stuart Hall's insights have been absolutely phenomenal, particularly in producing sort of British race theory as well. So I just wondered if on one level then it isn't so novel for you to tell us that there are these separate ways of thinking about racism, one being material, one being much more cultural, symbolic, right? But I get that it serves a purpose for you to sort of delineate anti-Semitism as a separate form. But also, if when thinking about racism in the contemporary world, we think about the experience of the Holocaust and what comes after that in terms of the various different sort of state or supranational level United Nations, for example, interventions, that it's through the experience of anti-Semitism or the Holocaust that we arrive at a sort of more detailed, comprehensive understanding of racism. So my question really is it's kind of provocative to ask, what purpose does it serve then to sort of delineate anti-racism as you do from a different understanding of racism, which for many of us, racism is informed by that sort of unique experience of racism against Jews from that period. Thank you very much.
And if I could just follow up, given we only have 4 or 5 minutes left, with a question I think that flows straight from what Ajmal just asked you, Leo. Um, if I could also push you and be a bit provocative, as it were, I wonder if some of the categories or classifications, rather, that you're working with are too narrow and rigid. So there's Marxism on the one hand and postcolonialism on the other hand, and you talk about these in their singular form. So Marxism is charged with false consciousness. But of course, the most prolific and profound writing against false consciousness has come from within traditions of Marxism. Similarly, the charge that you give to Marxism that it failed to address anti-Semitism, well, Christina has mentioned critical theory, but beyond the world of theory, I think activists in the Russian Revolution would be puzzled by the charge that they didn't take anti-Semitism seriously because they spent much of the revolution dealing with it. Now, we might think there's not much of theoretical value in that, but there were hundreds of thousands of pages of literatures produced by the Marxist state, the early Bolshevik state, in and against anti-Semitism. And Enzo Traverso has written a book about this, Marxists and the Jewish question, detailing the ways in which different Marxists really grappled with anti-Semitism. We might say inadequately so or not, but they grappled to various degrees nevertheless. And we could look to the work of people like Satnam Vardi today, who continues to locate anti-Semitism within a Marxist historical and conceptual theoretical frame. So, and similarly, the claim that it's functionalist. I mean, Ajmal mentioned Stuart Hall, who of course designated to racism a relative autonomy in the Althusserian sense within a Marxist frame. And similarly with postcolonial theory, that it's just about skin color. I think we could call, I think both Said and Fanon, who we might think of as an anti rather than postcolonial theorist, would maybe not recognize that accusation. So I just wonder if the classifications that they're using, Marxism and postcolonialism, are too kind of narrowly construed here to do justice to the literatures that you cite. But yeah, I'll stop there because there's not long. I also had a quibble. Yeah, I'll stop.
Okay, thank you. Very quick because we have not much time left. To the first question with class, of course, class is a social category and race sees itself as a natural category. And the idea would be that, or the Marxist idea would be that racism has the function of a naturalization of class positions. That would be one idea. And the anti-Irish racism, I think, would be a good example for a racism that is more, based on not on skin color, more on religion, culture, language, and so on. And you mentioned also, I think, nationalism. This is also, I think, an important point to analyze the connection between racist ideology and nationalist ideology, which emerged in the framework of the modern state. To the second question, I'm not sure if I understand it completely. Your point with whiteness, that there's a kind of racism that works not with difference but with similarity. But I'm also, I have to say, not very familiar with this with whiteness studies, so I have also to go more into it. But my impression is that there is a basic, there's one interesting idea in whiteness studies, that is that the dominant position, the position that sees itself as white, sees itself as the normal one, that one that is not marked, and measures every other social behavior or position. Maybe that's your point, but I'm not sure if I get it correctly. And then I can answer the last two questions. I try to answer it together. Of course, and I try to say it in the first place. I don't know if my talk, the categories I have are too narrow. Maybe they are too overgeneralizing. Maybe that's more the problem. Like as I said, of course it's very broad. read a lot of stuff, and I abstractified, and I tried to work to highlight what for me seemed the basic ideas, but of course it's not really differentiated, and I simplify, and there are lots of scholars who fall not in these categories, and Stuart Hall would be one of them. And the Frankfurt School, of course, is also not this kind of Marxism that I'm criticizing. So maybe when I write about this, I have to be more specific, and maybe the categories I open. I first planned to speak not about Marxist theories in general, but about racial capitalism theories. So it would be a little bit more narrow. So yeah, you're right. I have to specify and to differentiate more. Yeah, I accept this critique. And I have also to go deeper into, as I said, I know Postone, but as you mentioned, there are maybe other Marxist theories on anti-Semitism, and I didn't read the book of Traverso, and so I have to read more on this. So maybe I have to be more differentiated.
I think we could all do with more differentiation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Leo, for a really rich, theoretically dynamic talk of a topic that is of tremendous importance, clearly, to many of us. And we're really grateful for you bringing this work in progress material to us in this way and sharing it with us. I see that there is a hand up, but we are out of time. I'm very sorry. I think it's April Rosenblum. I'm very sorry. We are 2 minutes over, so we're going to stop. But perhaps April, you can
That
write
was an accident, sorry.
Okay. Well, we're going to close the session now. But once again, Leo, thank you, and thanks to everyone who came and asked such interesting questions. Bye bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.